thank you everybody for joining us. It's really great to see so many faces and so many names in the community. We're really looking forward to having another NeuroBiz Now discussion. Today's focus, as you probably know, is on uncertainty and decision making. And we've invited a few of our Wharton Neuroscience Initiative faculty affiliates to join in this conversation, and I will introduce them each in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to sort of tell everybody that most people are joining with their microphones off, and we would ask you to keep your microphones off. But we do want this to be an interactive discussion, and we would really love to have questions from the community at large. So in BlueJeans, there's a chat function on the right side. And what we would encourage you to do is that if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to inject into the discussion, to just either write the word comment or question in the chat window. And if you want to write your question in full, that's absolutely fine. Sometimes that helps us all to know what the context of the question is going to be, but it also helps for you to remember what your question might have been, because sometimes it takes us a little while to get to everybody's questions. But please do use that chat window. I will be moderating the discussion and sort of keeping an eye out on that chat function as we go along. And so that's my basic thing, but it would be great if we could start seeing some of your videos. So it's not required, but it's always really nice to see people's faces at this time, when we're all working away from each other. And so we would encourage you also to turn your video camera on, or to turn it on if you're able to, if you're asking a question. That would be great, but it's absolutely not required. Your voice is sufficient. If you'd rather not speak out loud, I can also read your question and reference you in that. But just let me know if that's what your preference is as we go along. All right. So with that, I think we'll get started. So as many of you know, this is a Wharton Neuroscience Initiative event. We are an initiative at the University of Pennsylvania that's really trying to do some groundbreaking work to synergize the business community at large and neurosciences. So what we really aim to do is build a community where we can start to have conversations about tackling real world problems and challenges from the context and knowledge of both disciplines, from business practice and business research to neuroscientific practice and neuroscience research. We have a really a broad and diverse community ourselves, and we encourage a very broad and diverse community to join us in these conversations, because I think only at the level of a broad, diverse discussion can we really learn and tackle some of the largest questions that are, out there. So it is my great delight to introduce our panelists who are joining, our sort of expert panelists who are joining to weigh in on in the discussion. So our first panelist is Professor Joe Cable. He's the Baird Term Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a leading expert on the psychology and neuroscience of choice behavior and decision making. And really, he has a broad canvas of work on learning, adapting, decision making. And much of his work explores how people's decisions deviate from rational choice theory, and what makes decision making and risk tolerance so variable across individuals. Joe is also the director of MindCore, which is a Penn-wide center focused on outreach, research, and education related to the integrative study of the mind. Hi, Joe. Why don't you just say a brief hello, and then I'll move on.
Hi, everybody.
Well, we don't have your sound.
Oh, hi, everybody.
I can hear him. Yep.
Think now. Great. Unfortunately, our second panelist was going to be Professor Anna Jenkins. She unfortunately has had a health crisis not related to COVID, but she is now unable to join us, which is really terrible. But she did email us to let us know, so we're taking that as a good sign that she will be in full recovery soon. Our next panelist is Dr. Preston Klein. Preston is the co-founder and director of research and education at the Mission Critical Team Institute, as well as a senior fellow at the Wharton Center for Leadership and Change Management. His focus is on improving mission critical teams, which he'll tell us more about. But in general, these are small teams of experts who are working on complex adaptive problems that require really rapid decision-making in contexts where there is often really high stakes, for example, life and death consequences. So we're really, really delighted to have Preston with us to talk about sort of the pushing the boundaries of decision-making and uncertainty in these high stakes conditions. Hi, Preston.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Your sound is off as well, but we'll resolve that pretty soon. And of course, Michael Platt, who is the faculty director of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, will serve as another of our experts, and he will be weighing in on some of the, the sort of uncertainty that we're navigating now in our social world. So why don't we start? Joe, why don't you, sort of begin us in our discussion about, what do we know really right now? I mean, this is a large question, but what do we know about uncertainty and decision making and the brain? In a very quick lay summary, as you can address that.
Sure. So our study, we've done a lot to look at how uncertainty affects brain responses, it affects our physiological responses, how it affects our decision making. And where we've started with those investigations is a question of when should we be learning fast and when should we be learning more slowly? Just as a simple example, it's not that we should always be learning at the same rate all the time. If you think about developing a highly technical skill like how to become a very good surgeon, when you're at the outset of your training, you want to be learning very fast. But once you've developed that technical proficiency, you actually don't want to be changing much. You only want to be fine-tuning your performance. And the hypothesis that's driven our work is that something that Donald Rumsfeld famously called known unknowns, that there is something that you do not know, that is the key signal that tells you that now's a time to really turn on the rate of learning. The philosophers have call this epistemic uncertainty, that there's something about the world that you don't know that in principle you could know. And it's that signal that in principle there's something that you could be knowing that drives learning. And so we've looked at this. I mean, we'll hear from Preston. We've looked at this in simple video game type experiments in the lab, where what we can do is introduce surprising changes into those environments, which increase the known unknowns, increase the epistemic uncertainty, and then ask, how does the brain respond? How does people's decision making respond? And what we see is that those surprising changes that increase uncertainty lead to a suite of combined changes across the brain and the body. In the brain, we see that uncertainty leads to profound increases in a part of the brain called the salience network, which exists to increase our arousal and attention to the outside world. We see that there's changes in how the brain regions are communicating with each other that we think set up during these periods of high uncertainty. They set up a greater, make us more attuned to the outside environment and to new information, and less attuned to old past information from our memories and from internal sources. And we see a corresponding change in the body of an increase in arousal that you can measure in lots of different ways by looking at somebody's pupil diameter or looking at their heart rate. And all of these changes are associated with an increase in the tone in the noradrenaline system. And what we think this suite of changes in the brain and the body do is they sort of turn on our learning machinery, and that this is an adaptive response when there really is when the world has changed and there's things that are surprising and there's things to learn, we should be paying attention. So how I think that relates to our current environment is I think it gives us an understanding of why it is that we're all hyper vigilant and completely on edge at the moment, because we have just lived through perhaps the most profound, surprising change in how the world works that any of us have experienced in our lives. And this has turned all of this brain and body machinery on. And that's why we're obsessively checking the news and can't seem to turn off the wheels in our head. We can talk a little bit about how we should react to that, but I think what all of our work suggests is what's the adaptive principles behind why we're all on edge and hypervigilant at the moment, and that's because it's an adaptive response to incredibly surprising changes that tell us, that there's things we got to figure out and learn.
Great, thank
I'll
you. Thank you. I have follow-ups, but I think in an effort to diversify the conversation, I'll come back to those. So Preston, why don't you weigh in on the kinds of challenges that you're seeing, that that a whole new cadre, a whole new cohort of frontliners, first responders, mission critical teams are now facing, and the kinds of decision contexts that are really real, and how that's impacting your thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. I look up to you and Joe and Michael, so it's lovely to be on a call where I get to sort of walk you through my current lived experience and then get to reflect on the science that underpins it. So let me ground this in some context, just to give us a framework in which to think about some of these issues. So right now, what's really interesting about what Joe was talking about is that when we think about uncertainty, a medical worker, a frontline medical worker, think about a surgeon, a nurse, a paramedic, they're used to a certain amount of medical uncertainty, meaning that there's knowledge about the science itself as practitioners, where they have what they call an uncertainty tolerance. You have to understand that in the world we live in right now, there's not only medical uncertainty, there's contextual uncertainty. And so think about it in this way. A firefighter, a law enforcement person, they will always go towards the problem. They will leave their house, they will go towards the problem, and they have to manage the uncertainties that they enter. Medical workers, the problem always comes to them, and they can be certain about the context they're working in. They could literally spray paint people's feet on the floor. You know where to stand in surgery. What's happening now, though, is that when people get out of bed in the morning, doctors and surgeons, and they're walking to work, they're walking towards the problem for the first time, because they are now susceptible to COVID. They're susceptible to getting COVID and bringing it back home. So there's personal threats that are messing with their ability to conceptualize what is certain in their life. And what Joe was talking about, that ability to turn on that learning is not now happening not only from a professional point of view, but from a personal point of view. And things they used to feel very competent in, they're not feeling competent in, which leads to a lack of confidence. And in their jobs, they absolutely need confidence. And so it's pretty fascinating, because some of the contextual things, and this is what I sort of will sort of sum up with here, is that they're often used to working on what we call intact teams. I would go to work, I would have a similar group of people that I've always worked with. We'd work together on a problem set that I have expertise on. Those are intact teams, and often I'm working in an environment that is somewhat temporally unconstrained, which is to say, I've got some time to schedule out a surgery, for example. I've got some times to think about this. I'm not including people that are normalized in this environment, like trauma surgeons or ER docs or ER personnel. They're used to this environment. I'm talking about the rest of the hospital who works in pretty predictive environments. They're now being pulled out of those predictive environments, and in some cases being put on what we call swarms or X teams, where they get pulled out of their sort of normal experience, and they're put on teams with people they don't necessarily know, and sort of learning their job as they go. And so you've got personnel who have joined their particular medical kind of practice because they actually desire and excel in environments of high predictability. And they're now being put in places of low predictability. And that's creating the kind of heightened arousal, right? Hypervigilance that Joe was talking about. It's increasing anxiety, and that extra sort of emotional valence, that context, is very disruptive, not only from the individual point of view, but for them working in team environments or cultural environments that require a certain amount of stoic. Here we go, and they're used to having answers to questions, and a lot of them are now environments where they're like, we're going to figure it out. And that's very unsettling for people whose job it is to know the answer. And so that's a couple of ways just to ground us in some very specific context of behaviors that we're currently seeing. And just to say this out loud, part of what we're learning from this is because of our support from Arena Labs, who's doing these fusion cell calls of doctors from around the world that are at different stages of the surge in the virus at hospitals. So you have people that are both in that anxiety place of it hasn't hit us yet, we don't know what we don't know, going back to what Joe was talking about. People that are in the midst of it and are tired and physically exhausted and stressed, and then people that are hoping they're seeing the backside of it and don't want any false summits. And so there's really a variety of environments that we're sort of talking about, but it's a super interesting discussion to think about what's happening in the brain right now. And I think I'll just stop there with that.
Great, thanks. I think this is going to be a really fun discussion. I think we could probably do this all day, as I think we've noted before. So, Michael, why don't you weigh in, because I think Joe sort of talked about some of the mechanisms and some of the individual variations and how we learn and adapt. I think one of the things that's that this particular crisis is really bringing to the fore is this difference in how we are socially engaging with each other, and how that's particularly pushing the system and our own responses in a particular kind of way.
Yeah. So happy to be here again, speaking, and so glad to be joined by all of you and to follow on what Joe and Preston have been talking about. Excuse me. And I'm really grateful to have Preston here for this deep insight into the connection of how this is playing out in these really critical environments. So I wish Anna were here to talk about the social world, but I'll be happy to speak about it myself. It's something I think about all the time. And, we can say this over and over again, the world is upside down right now. So normally, in sort of normal times, other people are kind of, dealing with other people is sort of the most uncertain environment we can be in, right? Because we don't know what's going on inside other people's heads. So we have an evolved set of mechanisms in our brains that allow us to make inferences about people's motivations and what they care about and their state of mind and how much knowledge they have. But there's still tremendous uncertainty about what's going on in another person. But now the world is totally upside down and is uncertain. And so now other people are actually a source of information. So that's true in normal times. We rely on other people's actions and observing what happens when they engage in those actions, their decisions, as a as a source of information that can help to guide us. And so what I think what we're seeing right now is what is a phenomenon we often refer to as social contagion. So it's not like virus contagion, but it's very, very similar in the sense that, our arousal systems are keyed up, our sense of uncertainty is very high, and so we kind of go into automatic mode, paying attention to what other people are doing, often copying their behaviors. So you see this in panic in financial markets, you see this in panic buying, people hoarding toilet paper, all those kinds of very bizarre things that people are doing, because our brains are kind of gone into automatic mode to basically copy what other people are doing, and to also seek out information from other people. I don't know about you, but how much time do you spend on social media looking at posts by other people who are trying to get some guidance, trying to get some information? Maybe somebody knows something more than you. And I don't know about you, but what ends up happening to me is it's just, you reach a point of saturation and overload, and you have no idea what to trust and what not to trust. So it's a really kind of shockingly different world from the one we've ever been in. We're not interacting with people in the real world. We're operating on what we see on cable news and online and what we might hear on the radio. We're in a kind of keyed up, heightened automatic mode that's driving our behavior in very, very strange kinds of ways. And I'd love to kind of hear what Preston thinks about that, because as he was saying, he's locked into these folks who are doing very just performing real mission critical jobs, but where they have to come together on teams with people they don't know. And so I'd love to hear about how he thinks these issues are playing out.
Thank you, Michael. I think one of the my partner, Coleman Ruiz, who's a former Navy SEAL, wrote a paper sort of describing for frontline medical workers what it's like on deployment. And because in many cases, that is what it is like for them right now. They're having to learn a different way of doing business and a way of conceptualizing. And there's another way to sort of think about this, not to startle anyone, but one of the real concerns in the country right now is that we're entering wildland fire season. So the Southwest and the West will start to have fires. Unlike the military, the fire service, you do not sign an oath. We are dependent on Americans actually picking up shovels and fighting wildland fires. If they're home caring for their parents, that's tough to do. And so in the same way, there's been medical personnel that have had to ask this question: do I do my job or do I look after my family? And it's the first time they've ever had to ask this question. And going back to your earlier point, there's a contagion effect. So depending on if there's leadership in the hospital or peer leadership within their community that can help them make meaning of that experience, make meaning of those decisions, what they're left with is fear. And so this is where leadership and the lack of leadership is really critical, because people are in places where for the first time and many times in their life, they're having to make no kidding decisions every morning. Do I put the welfare of our society and my job before my family's welfare? And that's happening every day right now.
I can't imagine having to make those decisions. We're pretty privileged, at least those of us who work for the university. I'd love to come back to Joe, and I want to dig into this question a little bit more deeply about the sort of negative emotional feelings that we have. So it's one thing to have a mechanism, right, in your brain that detects that there's uncertainty, and it turns the system up to 11, Final Tap fans. But why do we have to feel bad about it, right? What's the point of the negative emotion? Can you weigh in on that?
Often negative emotion is a motivator to try and get us out of it, right? I mean, I think that's why all of our negative emotions exist, is they're telling us, this current situation isn't acceptable, do something to get out of it. And so I mean, I think that's why it feels so profoundly negative to be in this situation where there's lots of stuff that we just feel like we don't know anymore. I think one of the things that just to amplify what Preston just said, I think one thing that could reduce that negative emotion. I mean, I think part of what it's trying to motivate is, get a sense, is for us to try and figure out a sense of what does all of this mean and what is going on. And I think, as Preston was just saying, there's a way in which with the right leadership and the right message, you could fulfill some of that whole of what does this mean, and how should I interpret what's going on around me without necessarily knowing all of the answers. That if there is the right leadership or the right community that's saying, we're all in this together. Here's a little bit of explanation and meaning about what's happening in the current situation. And yes, there's things we don't know, and let's lay out the things that we don't know yet. But here's our strategy for how we're going to figure those things out. I think that's one way in which we'd be able to bring down some of the negative emotions turned up to 11 that we're all living with right now.
Yeah, I think that's critical, and I think you're right, and it brings out, I think, something that we're learning in terms of the neuroscience of leadership, which is that a good leader is somebody who takes responsibility, right? I mean, there's a variety of different styles of leadership. You can be authoritative, you can be distributive, kind of democratic, easygoing, whatever. But it's about standing up and taking responsibility. And in this case, you're standing up and taking responsibility and saying, look, there's uncertainty. You're going to have to live with that. But here's what we have to do to get through this, right? So I'd love to hear from Preston on that side of things with regard to leadership.
It's really interesting, just to contextually just remind you, the world that I live in is a mission critical team world, which means that I work in teams, not individuals, and teams aren't just collections of individuals, they're interdependent. And so there are certain cultural things, there are certain contextual things that really matter. And in leadership, one of the things that my research over the last few decades have shown, that while there are many traits and attributes that are critical to being a good mission critical team, many of them can be sort of reduced to, and not to be reductionist, to trust and competence. And if you have trust, and if I trust you and I believe you're competent, then all things become possible. We can work through everything else. But to both of your points, one of the ways that I can both lose and gain trust is by either taking responsibility for that which is maybe not even in my control, but I do have authority over, vice blaming others. And so what we have found over and over again is that if you're able to, the philosopher Ian Hacking once wrote that certainty, the concept of certainty, etymologically, used to mean that which only God can know, right? And so this idea of uncertainty is just this idea of being human, right? So welcome to being human. There's a bunch of stuff we don't know. You're going to have to get comfortable with that. And the closer you get to the edge of things, where my teams are, the more comfortable they are with the fact that, yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't know. But even knowing that, it's still my responsibility to both take us out and take us back. And together, I need you to be right over my right shoulder, and I need you to know that without looking. Because if I have to look, trust and competence is gone. So I need to do that without looking. And that small, subtle, known truth is key to the whole thing. And that starts with the fact that the guy behind you or the woman behind you is looking forward, knowing that Michael or Joe or Preston or Zab will continue doing the thing they're going to do. And then all I need to do is follow in and wait until my turn to comes. And one other sort of variance that I want to throw in here, which is somewhat tangential but is important, is that at the edge of things, as we've seen teams evolve to these new emergent problem sets, we've seen a slow, and we're writing about this now, but a slow transition from the model of leadership and followership to a model of membership. And here's what I mean by that. Instead of there being a tip of a spear, what they used to say, it's more like a rolling spiked ball. And so you might have, Michael, you might have the authority, but part of your job on the team, once we enter what we call the immersion event, is to know when you step forward, and just as importantly, when you step back. And me as a member needs to know, much like a dance, when it's my job to step in front of you and which my job to step back again. And in that way, we can have that sort of these what are called liquid networks, these fluid responses to problems. But once again, just to bring it full circle, this is all highly dependent on trust and competence. And this is highly dependent on people taking responsibility for the context that we're in, even if they can't control it.
Yeah, I think that's super challenging, right? So you can't control it, but you have to take responsibility to instill trust. Joe, you've done a lot of work on self-regulation and self-control, and that seems particularly important right now. I think when uncertainty is high, when the future seems very far away, it's perhaps hard to make good decisions. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, what can we do to help regulate our behaviors, our strategies, right, within this environment? How do we do that? How can we turn down, go from 11 and turn it down to something reasonable like 8, and maybe, just be able to take a little bit better perspective and make perhaps better decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean, and we're starting from a difficult point from the perspective of self-regulation. One of the first things that we've seen in our studies of self-regulation is that it gets a lot harder as uncertainty increases. that when when the future becomes more uncertain and less about exactly what's going to happen, that those are the points in time when it becomes even harder to regulate your emotions and to control your behavior and to persist towards your goals. So we're starting off, behind the 8 ball, so to speak. I think the general principle with what works and what doesn't with respect to self-regulation is that as you become more it's more successful as you become more proactive and less successful as you become more reactive. That if you're forced to you can regulate your behavior and your emotions in the moment. You can, suppress that extreme fear or anxiety that you're feeling in the moment, but that it's much more effective if you think and act proactively, such that you're a step ahead of the game, so that you are thinking about what situations do I put myself into that will help me regulate my emotions better, regulate my behavior better. How can I shape those situations, whether that's, reaching out to people who, in some ways it comes back to team formation for the people who are on teams, but the extent to which we can get ahead of the game and be putting ourselves in situations that where we don't have to do so much in the moment regulation and control, we're going to be better at our overall levels of keeping control of our emotions. So it's about choosing the situations right and setting ourselves up, putting ourselves into situations that help bring the temperature down, bring the dial down, and not so much putting ourselves into situations that turn it up.
Well, do you have suggestions for how you actually do that? So how do you put yourself in that kind of situation? Yeah. What if you can't?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the some of it is about knowing what works for you as a person. I think certainly reaching out to support networks and spending time reconnecting with people. I think those personal connections are something that help to help to make us feel centered and help us to make us feel like the world is not so turned upside down. So remembering to do that and being you know, and actually, you know, and doing it, and planning to do it, right? Not just letting it happen. I think also recognizing the things that maybe help that aren't helpful for us to do, and try and come up with strategies to avoid the things that aren't helpful. As much as we like to, you know, obsessively check Facebook for new information that might, you know, that might help us completely understand what's going on around the world, I think more often than not that isn't helpful from an emotion regulation perspective. And so, you know, planning ahead and saying, okay, what, you know, either limiting that time or saying, okay, when I feel the urge to check social media, instead I'm gonna you know, reach out and call somebody, and try and connect with the world in that way, rather than doing something that I found is not helpful for me.
Yeah, or do 10 push-ups every time you feel like checking Twitter, right?
Michael, I wondered whether you might, you know, briefly go over some of the, I mean, I know like Emily Falk isn't here with us, but she's done some incredible work on the importance of value affirmations, and you know, I think that's something that a lot of people are talking about right now, to help, you know, to help people's coping mechanisms, is to go back through sort of a value, you know, to go through, you know, think very carefully about your values and your perspective taking in that process.
Sure. I mean, I wish Emily were here to talk about her very, very beautiful work, which is also a very great practical benefit. And she's worked for a long time on a couple of things, on social influence and persuasion, and then also behavior change. And I think everybody is, you know, we were already really interested in behavior change before this whole crisis, and now I think even more so. And in the last couple of years, she's really brought these two strands of work together to identify and uncover what happens in our brains when we listen to messages we don't want to hear, right? And in fact, we don't listen to them. Our brains tune them out, which is why most of us can't change our behavior. Why, if you're a smoker and you see an anti-smoking ad, you don't respond to it. Or maybe you don't want to stay in your house and practice social distancing, so you don't actually pay attention to that message. And what she's found in a couple of really beautiful studies, that so-called self-transcendent practices, which have been around for a long time in a variety of different forms, in a variety of different cultures. That is, when we get outside of ourselves and think or imagine in kind of vivid form either values that have been very important to us, like family or spirituality or nation or community or something like that, money, who knows, and think about a time that helped us through a profound challenge, or practicing something like kindness meditation. So thinking about a specific person and thinking about something very good happening to them. Okay, so these are practices that have been around a long time. It's been suggested that they're sort of transformative, and they change the way that you and your brain interacts with the world. And what she's found is that when you engage in these practices, this sort of turns up the volume in the parts of the brain that Joe has been so instrumental in studying and identifying, the so-called value network. This is the network in the brain that puts a personal value on things and motivates us to do something or choose something. So when you engage in one of these self-transcendent practices, your brain becomes more open, more receptive to this information you didn't want to hear. So you're more likely to pay attention to that anti-smoking ad if you were a smoker. Maybe the same would be true for practicing social distancing. And what's remarkable is that she's shown that the degree to which that value system kind of gets cranked up predicts, like 3 months into the future, how much you will sustain this change in behavior. So it's not just something that happens within the half-hour context of the experiment. but it's something that can persist. And I think this is really, this is really profound to me in several ways. I mean, one is it shows there's a real scientific, basis and reality for these practices. Not that you shouldn't engage in them, even if there weren't, but I think it says, hey, this is real. This is not a placebo. It works, and it works in a way that makes sense, given what we know about the role of the value network, the value system in our brains in terms of motivating behavior. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Joe.
No, I mean, as you were talking, I mean, I think one of the things that those different practices have in common is that they get you to think about how this is bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have been studying is how do you get people to be motivated to act for their future selves. And if you're trying to quit smoking, for example, you're doing it for yourself 10, 15 years in the future. And one of the ways that I think you can get people to, and that the process of getting people motivated to act for themselves in the future is very similar as the process of getting people to be motivated to act for any other person, right? Which is to get them out of the here and now, what's happening to me right now at this moment, and to think about things that sort of go beyond them. And so I think what Emily's work is showing very nicely is that these long-standing practices are having that effect of making it about more than just yourself, and that has knock-on effects on what you're motivated to do and how you act.
Great. I would just like to ask the community at large to please do write questions if you have them. I'm moderating the chat window, so feel free. There's no boundaries, so we're here to address your questions too. So just as a quick plug, I just wanted to remind people that to go ahead and ask your questions in the chat window, and I'd love to get you guys to speak them.
Well, this, in the absence of a question at the moment, this little discussion reminds me of my favorite joke, which is, a Buddhist monk walks up to a hot dog vendor in Central Park and says, "Make me one with everything." Okay, that's the first part of the joke. And then the hot dog vendor makes him one with everything, hands the hot dog over to the monk. The monk hands the hot dog vendor a $20 bill, and the hot dog vendor puts it in his pocket, and the monk says, hey, where's my change? And the hot dog vendor says, "Change comes from within." I'm not hearing a lot of laughter. I guess your microphones are off. So.
We're all muted. That's right.
Please ask questions. We're going to get more jokes.
That's right. Preston, I wondered whether you could weigh in on how you see, your communities getting into their own personal value systems, and how that might be changing their own resilience, and and maybe adapting as well.
I think one of the things, going back to what Joe said a little bit ago, and what Michael was saying, is that I think there's a lot to be said for being intentional in your life, right? And not just being reactive and waiting for, events to happen to you, but to actually choose those aspects of your life that you can control. And some of those are sustaining, right? And so, as Joe pointed out, connection and belonging, we know from just human beings, we're social animals. So connection and belonging really matter. We know that we breathe, and oftentimes we don't breathe well. And we know that there's a lot of practice out there that if you just take a minute and think about your breathing, it can move you forward. Michael's joke about push-ups is not actually bad. Changing your chemistry, getting your blood flowing, especially when you're sedentary, really matters. And lastly, we spent most of our existence outside, not inside, as a species. And every once in a while, going out and just staring at the horizon, just being outside matters, even if you're not doing extraordinary things. And so I say all of that because some of the most lethal, dangerous people I know, that's what they do. It's not rocket science. It's not some secret sauce that no one knows about. It's eat less, exercise. Like we know the answers. It's just about being intentional to go back to what Joe was saying, being intentional about it.
Great. There are a couple of questions. Someone is knowing whether there are any good case studies of that's a very broad question about neuroscience in the business setting. Of course, we're right there at the cutting edge, trying to build that. Someone else is asking if there are any books that any of you might recommend that are related to this kind of thing around decision making and uncertainty and some of the other conversations that we've had about values and risks, et cetera.
I'll let Joe and Preston weigh in on that first.
I'll jump in for the following reasons. Contextually, you have to understand that the reason that I am so enamored with the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative is because, and Josh Gibson is on the call from the Cleveland Indians, and we have this conversation all the time, which is 100 years of baseball have produced some really interesting traditions. Whether or not some of those are all valid, we actually don't know. And so I'm very historically hesitant. I actually call you about this question about books and articles because there's so much noise and misinformation out there that I really heavily rely on you to just check my math. And so there are books that I will throw out there, but I'll throw them out there only with the condition that you guys push back if I get it wrong. And so for me, Gary Klein's work on decision making under extreme conditions, right? Streetlights and shadows, things like that is useful. Kahneman's work is useful. Those are psychology books, not neuroscience books, but they're useful frameworks to explain some of these phenomenons. But as Zab has pointed out to me again and again, they have been made accessible to everyone to understand, and in that process have perhaps underexplained some pretty complex things, and in doing so misled some people down some paths that are sometimes not useful as we learn to know more. So that's that. I'll stop there with all those caveats.
Great. Well, I'll let you guys ponder the book side of things.
I'll make a shameless plug for. I happen to be completing a book right now on this topic, and so it'll, I have no idea what the marketing and publishing model during a pandemic is, but for now it's scheduled to be published in September.
We have a question from Katja Langebucher. Katja, are you on and able to ask your question?
I'm happy to ask in person, yes. I was wondering, because of course I'm looking at this, from Europe. So I'm wondering whether there are any studies on the cross-cultural aspect of it. So, we're looking at really authoritarian leadership styles, such as Viktor Orban, for example. And then, of course, our motherly Angela Merkel. And then as opposed to, I don't know how to call Trump's leadership style. I wrote body style in the chat. And as unhappy as I guess all of us are with his style, I still think he has a leadership style which certain people might relate to. So my question is, are there studies on what type of leadership style works in what type of situation?
That's a great question, and it's great to see you, Katja. It's very nice to catch up with you. It's been a while. I think that this is a part of neuroscience that's still in development. It's very new, but kind of circling back to something I said before, there's a really nice set of studies that came out of University of Zurich, the neuroeconomics group there, which had explored this very question, which is sort of the rating different styles of leadership, but then sort of the effectiveness and then the engagement of the kind of the right, quote unquote, kind of brain networks that would allow people to make good decisions and to get people to follow them. And it really was not so much about the style of leadership, whether you're kind of warm buddy style or you're more authoritarian, but it's this this idea of responsibility, taking responsibility, and people who are responsibility averse do not make good leaders. Okay, they don't make good decisions, and people don't follow them, and people's brains somehow detect that they're actually that they are not taking responsibility for other people, if that makes sense. So I think you could be. Yeah, go ahead, Preston.
So there's some really interesting research in human factors research coming out of University of Texas Austin that was the origin of what is now called crew resource management, which is taught in all airlines and others where crews have to work together under great uncertainty. There's some really interesting research culturally about the differences about how risk averse or uncertainty averse different cultures are, and you can actually, there's studies that measure this, and this impacts the kind of leadership that is going to be salient. And so, for example, the classic example is Japanese pilots and their ability to speak truth to power, vice, say, American pilots. And you can measure the differences, and those differences result in a necessary different leadership style. But it also relates to the fact that some of those leadership styles perform better in times of urgency and criticality, and some don't. And so what's really interesting is that you have to overlay this concept of different leadership styles against the problem set that we are dealing with. And so if you're dealing with long-term, temporally unconstrained environments, the cultural leadership styles which might lend themselves more effectively might be less effective in urgent, critical environments. So that's a sort of a vague, ambiguous, but there is it's just to point out there's research done on this issue.
Josh Gibson, you want to get on and ask your question directly?
Yeah, I don't know if I can articulate it too well. I had a lot of thoughts jumbled in my head. But it was essentially like we've learned in a variety of different ways that cortisol and stress from uncertainty and stressful situations can disrupt the learning process and your ability to print memory. But Joe, I was really struck by what you started with in terms of actually some uncertain events can create the awareness of more known unknowns and kind of highlight something and make the system more attuned to the environment. The adrenaline system changes and like our learning machinery turns on. So how do you balance between the fact that cortisol can disrupt learning, but then we need kind of this heightened state and this uncertainty to actually spark learning? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think what it brings out is what I didn't quite say in my initial comments about uncertainty and learning is that of course that there's a limit to everything, and that in reality what you have is an inverted U-shaped curve relationship between arousal and learning. And sort of what I was talking about is that all of this is adaptive, and that you need to turn the key a little bit to get people engaged. I mean, that's why we have cortisol. That's why we have noradrenaline is to get the learning turned on. But of course, if this gets to be too much, and I think one of the ways in which and the way in which it can get to be too much is when we perceive that it's that we're not up to the task, and that we don't see a way in which we can possibly become up to the task. That if it gets too much, if we're too over aroused, if cortisol is too high, if noradrenaline is too high, then everything comes crashing down. And as you said, if we give the system too much gas, then we're not going to learn. Then people stop learning and they disengage, right? So yeah, I think your question highlights that it really is there's this inverted U-shaped relationship where what we're trying to do is to get at the optimal level of engagement, so that we're learning and moving forward and performing at a high level. And one of the dangers of being in a situation like we're in right now is that it just gets to be too much, and the whole system shuts off.
I mean, I think that's great, Joe. I mean, I think just to follow on that, it's worth noting that these, the two chemicals that we're talking about actually operate over different timescales. So where norepinephrine is something that is kind of can fluctuate very rapidly, and so it's very dynamic in terms of allowing us to track uncertainty and situations that are very fluid. Cortisol comes on more slowly, right? It's more like a hormone, and it lasts longer. And its job is more important for mobilizing energy, for mobilizing resources to allow us to take action. And the problem with both of these systems is that if they're turned on, they're great in the short term, right? But if they're turned all the way up for a long time, it's really, really bad for your health, right? And it's really, really bad for your brain. So it starts to have an impact, especially on the parts of your brain that are critical for learning and memory. So the hippocampus begins to degenerate the longer you're under that kind of stress, the more that cortisol is pumping through your system. And, that's why, partially why you see the effects of like long-term stress when people, when people go to war, when people are in the aftermath of a disaster, and living with that day to day to day, that has a huge impact, which can be lasting, right, in terms of the impact on cognition and decision making. And so that's a real concern for right now, because our systems are turned up to 11, and it's been going on for whatever, 8 weeks, and we don't know how much long. This is going to be a really interesting impact on human functioning.
We have so many questions that we are not going to be able to get to all of them. But Elise had a question for you, Preston. So I'll let her get on and ask that directly.
Hi, Preston.
Hi,
My question is about trust. So we know there are things that help establish trust quickly in the brain, and when you're looking at these newly forming teams, these X teams and these swarms, and you talk about the importance of trust to effective performance in these highly uncertain environments, what are those teams doing to help establish that trust quickly that you've seen working well? And then flip side, like what's going on to trust in the established teams?
It's a great question, and it's quite honestly, the research on X teams and swarms were just actually getting underway before COVID, and so there's a lot we don't know because it's a relatively recent phenomenon in terms of teamwork and things like that. I will point you to Atul Gawande's work, the surgeon out of Harvard, who's done work on this, and there's some other emerging events called the Surgical Theater Cap Challenge, which you can see online, and basically what these are. You'll see this online right now, is that because medical workers are fully scrubbed and they're sort of invisible behind their masks, there are things that are being done now that historically haven't had to be done. So medical workers are now putting their name across their cap. They're putting their pictures and their bios on their front. They're doing things before they scrub up, simple things like shaking each other's hands, me physically touching you in an appropriate way, me looking in your eyes, me knowing your name. These are very subtle things, but they're tribal things. And in times of great uncertainty, this need for feeling like I'm part of a group matters for our ability to not feel isolated. Going back to what Joe was talking about, and I would defer to the science to them, but the feelings of connectedness and belonging become increasingly important in times like this. So those small gestures of courtesy become really, really important.
Preston, those aren't just gestures of courtesy, because we know that things like positive eye contact, social touch, causes the release of oxytocin in our brains, and that release of oxytocin is the trust chemical, and really is.
Well, unfortunately, we're at time, and what we are also aware of is how precious people's time are. But thank you so much to Preston, Joe, Michael, and the rest of the community here for joining us at NeuroBiz Now. We look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about social contagion and the financial markets.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hopefully they'll be contagiously going the other direction by next week.
That's right. And thanks for all of you for writing questions. Hopefully we'll continue to have many, many more opportunities to talk to one another and get through some of those other questions. I think some of the themes that were emerging around leadership and change are fantastic, and we will add those to our list for our future events as well.